evening today. It is actually our schedule that has been delayed before it, and now thanks God that we are still can hear Professor D, can see Professor D lecturer today, and Professor D that I would like to introduce to Palisa Maulidiva Ginting. She will become the moderator for your lecture today. Okay, Palisa, please say hello to Professor D.
Hello, Professor D. My name is Felicia Maulidiva Ginting. Nice to meet you.
Okay, so
Nice to meet you.
dan jadi adik-adik semua, Profesor D nanti akan ada translate-nya juga. Dia kayak punya software-nya juga untuk mentranslatekan bahasa Indonesia. Jadi saya harap Anda semua bisa menyimak. Kemudian nanti pada saat Profesor di kuliah, boleh nggak apa-apa off cam, tapi pada saat sesi diskusi, Pak Lisa, kalau bisa semuanya bisa on cam ya. Dan tolong tanyakan semua terkait dengan dasar-dasar fisiologi yang akan beliau ajarkan. Oke, okay, Falisa, now time is yours to start.
Good morning, all. Professor D. Silverthorn, you from University of Texas in Austin. Good morning, Professor Irfan from UNSI, and all of my friends and all of my teachers that have been in this Zoom meeting today. Today, we're going to discuss and learn about physiology from Professor D. Silverthorn. For Professor D. Silverthorn, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me share my screen. All right. And let me start it. There we go. All right. Can you see my screen okay now? So
Yes.
Good. Good morning from Texas, where it is still Sunday night, and I am delighted to once again join Professor Irfan's physiology students to talk about physiology, because it is absolutely one of my, hang on a minute. I'm going to have to, somehow we ended up on the last slide. There we go. All right, try again. So I am happy to be with you, and I am showing you a picture that I took, and it's hard to believe that it was 14 years ago that I came to visit Palembang. But the talk today is about physiology as an integrative science, and I love to talk about physiology. Physiology is critical for medicine. It is the basis of medicine, but it also overlaps with many other fields, so that no matter what your interest is, if it's anatomy or pharmacology or biochemistry, there's something in physiology for you that will keep your interest and make it interesting for you. So I would like you to start and just think to yourself, which of these organ systems is the most important? And what I ask my students to do to make sure they're thinking is I say, write it down, because that way you actually have to commit yourself to an answer. So think about it. And it turns out the answer is cannot say that there is one organ system that is the most important. They are all important. None of the systems can work without help from the other systems. And this is what we mean when we say physiology is integrative. So as students, you study and we teach the body systems in a linear fashion. And this is because time is linear. The course starts and often with cell physiology, and then we go to the nervous system and endocrine system and immune system. because those are our three control systems. And then we may go to cardiovascular, respiratory, renal, digestive, and usually end with reproductive. And we have gone through these in a line because time is linear. But the reality is, physiology is not linear, it is integrated. And one of your challenges will be to be able to think about all of these systems at one time. My students want to say, we finished cardiovascular, I can put it in a box and not think about it again. But it's not the way it works. So today, as we talk about physiology as an integrated science, we are going to start with something that has become very popular in many places around the world, and this is called core concepts. And simpler language for that is the big ideas of physiology and the patterns that repeat over and over again. And if you learn the pattern, it makes learning the details much simpler because you already know the pattern. Then we will talk some about homeostasis, which is the underlying principle for all of physiology. And then we'll say a little bit at the end about pathophysiology. But I think if you keep in mind that once you have a good understanding of all the organ systems, it's going to be much easier for you to recognize the core concepts and also to see the integration of the different body systems. So I have chosen 8 core concepts. Depending upon who you are talking to, some people may have more, some people may have less. The Australian physiologists have come up with their own list of core concepts that doesn't fit the American pattern. But I picked 8 and I have given them each little pictures or icons to go with them. So homeostasis is the first because homeostasis is that underlying principle for physiology. And then communication, because without communication, the different body systems can't talk to each other. I am very fond of compartmentation because it divides the body up into different kinds of compartments. And one of the challenges that we face mechanistically in physiology is how do we get communication between the different compartments? And then molecular interactions are critical, especially as you go on into medicine, because this is how we decide to come up with pharmacology and the drugs that we use to treat different conditions. Gradients and flow are responsible for movement across from compartment to compartment. And energy, of course, is something that no organism can live without. Mass balance also goes back to compartments, and we'll see that in a little bit in a later slide. And then underlying it all are the structure-function relationships, the anatomy compared to the physiology. It's impossible to separate them many times, but we will see examples of how the structure helps tell what the function is. Or from the function, you can almost predict what the structure would be. So physiology, structure, and function goes across all levels of all levels of organization, from the chemical and biochemical level all the way up through the intact organism. And so as we're thinking about physiology in a system, we must be able to think about all of the different levels of organization in that system. Compartmentation, and there's our little compartmentation icon. The smallest compartment that we think about is the cell, but even cells have compartments within them. So the mitochondria form a compartment, or the nucleus, or the Golgi body. And then, much more important for medicine, are the body fluid compartments. The intracellular fluid, shown there with the cells on the right in yellow, and the extracellular fluid, which is composed of the blood plasma on the left, as well as the interstitial fluid that lies between the cells. And then, of course, if you think about it, our whole body is a compartment. And so we have to think about our internal compartment. Our internal environment is the term we use for homeostasis, compared to what is happening in the world around us, the external environment. So the body is actually an open system because we are always exchanging material between the external environment and our internal environment. And this is where mass balance comes in, because in order to keep the content of the body constant in something, say sodium balance, if we're losing sodium, we need to take sodium in. Or if we're bringing sodium in and it's going to be too high, we must have a mechanism for getting rid of it from the body. So this is mass balance. The internal and external environments are critical because the internal environment of the body is where we maintain homeostasis. It is the external environment for the cells, but it is the internal environment for the body. And so everything that comes into or leaves our body goes first into the extracellular fluid before it can ever reach the intracellular fluid. Now, it does have to go through an epithelium, but we're talking about the body cells in general. And everything that comes or goes must cross an epithelium, an epithelial layer of at least one cell. So that means it must cross 2 cell membranes, 2 plasma membranes. And then from the extracellular fluid to the intracellular fluid, it will be crossing 1 membrane. So the epithelia, by changing their transporters and changing their properties in the membrane, can regulate what comes in, goes from the body. So this is a schematic of the body systems, and you can see them there. And the term lumen refers to the inside of a hollow organ or tube. And you see the lumens of the various organ systems here shown in white because they are actually part of the external environment surrounding this body with its brown edges. And one of the things to remember is that just because you swallow something in particular, or just because you breathe it in, it's not yet in your internal environment. That white digestive system is very much like the hole through a bead. It is in your body, but it is not yet part of the internal environment until it is absorbed across that digestive epithelium. So keeping in mind that inside the body means different things depending upon whether the substance is still in the lumen and therefore part of the external environment, or if it is actually across and in part of the extracellular fluid. This is why we can have E. coli living in our large intestines. It's really not in the body. It's still part of our external environment. Gradients and flow are one of the critical mechanisms for how physiological processes work. We have the bulk flow of fluids, where air and blood are both a fluid. And in order to get the bulk flow of the fluid, we have to have a pump. And that pump then creates pressure gradients, and we get flow of the fluid down a pressure gradient. So I think you know what the pump for the blood is what? It's the heart. And what is the pump for air to move in and out of the respiratory system? It is the skeletal muscles of the thoracic cage that create pressure gradients and therefore create flow. In addition, we can have flow down chemical gradients, and chemical gradient is simply another way of saying concentration gradient. And then we have the combined electrochemical gradients that we see that are so critical in electrical signaling in the nervous system. And then we have all of the various mechanisms by which substances cross membranes, cell membranes. So they range from simple diffusion for things that are lipophilic to movement through proteins, either channels that are open and have a continuous water-filled center, or carriers that actually bind to the substances they're transporting. And then we have vesicular transport, movement in and out of cells using vesicles. And everyone is familiar with endocytosis and exocytosis, but one of the most exciting things recently in physiology is extracellular vesicles, ECV. And these are vesicles that we are learning that cells and tissues release into the interstitial fluid to send molecules to other tissues. And it's a way of communication that until recently we had no idea that it existed. Remember then, you've got gradients, but you can move substances against a gradient. But to do so, it requires energy. And so there's energy, our next core concept. I think everyone is familiar with the type of potential energy that we store in chemical bonds, particularly the importance of storing energy in ATP to drive reactions or to drive transporters. But you have to remember that we also can store energy in gradients. So a concentration gradient is a form of potential energy, or an electrochemical gradient such as the one you see here, where potassium has been allowed to go down its electrochemical gradient, leaving the cell until the concentration gradient moving it out of the cell is equal and opposite to the electrical gradient pulling the positively charged potassium back in. Our next core concept is molecular interactions, and one of the ones that is particularly important is protein binding. Almost everything that happens in the body is using a protein and binding to a protein somehow. You have enzymes, you have receptors for signal molecules, and you have the transport proteins that we just talked about that move substances across cell membranes. So molecular interactions take other forms as well, but I think to me, the protein binding one is one of the most critical. Here's an example of a protein binding that you might see. This is the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve showing the difference between binding of oxygen to the maternal hemoglobin protein versus the binding to the fetal hemoglobin protein. Different oxygen binding properties. So I have a task for you, and this is what I would do with my students. This is a picture showing the transport of oxygen in arterial blood. It is a concept map, and I want you to take a second, and I want you to see how many of the core concepts that we have talked about. There are 8 core concepts. How many of the core concepts can you see illustrated in this picture? And if you're in a room with classmates, go ahead and share, or you can share with each other. I'm assuming that you can message each other on your phones or devices. So take a second and see how many core concepts you see illustrated in this map. Okay, it's a little more difficult because I can't really see you and tell how fast you are working, but let me show you the ones that I came up with. So the first one is gradients. All of the processes that I put in the red box there require a gradient. Alveolar ventilation, the bulk flow of air between the environment and the alveoli, requires a gradient, a pressure gradient. Oxygen diffusion between the alveoli and the blood requires a concentration gradient. And then blood flow or perfusion to the alveoli also requires a gradient, the bulk flow of blood with the gradient created by the pumping action of the heart. All right, I hope that you all got that one. Number 2 is physical properties. This is part of structure and function. The physical properties of the system. So airway resistance. Are the airways constricted or are they relaxed? That will change the amount of work that needs to be done. What about the lung compliance? Is compliance changed because of some sort of pulmonary disease? What about the surface area allowing that is available for diffusion? And what about the diffusion distance? For instance, it will increase in pulmonary edema. And there are also conditions, again, going back to the compliance, where you're getting fibrotic deposition on the alveoli that will increase the distance that oxygen must diffuse. So we have gradients, we have physical properties. Here's protein binding. That whole right side of the map is protein binding. It's oxygen bound to hemoglobin. This is that same graph that I showed you on the last slide. And then one that we haven't directly talked about yet, but is here, is homeostasis. Because one of the acts of the body is to maintain the homeostasis, the appropriate concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, the pH, and also the body temperature. So here are 4 of the core concepts illustrated in this one process. So it should help you to be able to remember processes sometimes if you think about the concepts that are underlying the details of that particular process. So our next core concept then is communication. And communication can divide into local communication, and now we're talking about body-wide communication. Local communication that can be cell to cell through gap junctions. It can be diffusion from one cell to its neighbors. We have, particularly in the immune system, contact-dependent signaling, where one cell binds to another, it recognizes a receptor on another. And then we have all of our signals that are put out into the interstitial fluid to act on whatever cell has the appropriate receptor. So paracrine signals, autocrine signals, where the signal actually comes back and acts on the cell that secreted it, and cytokines, coming particularly the cytokines that come from the immune system. So those are all local forms. Then we have long distance communication, and that is critical for maintaining the integrated function. So we have hormones and cytokines that are transported through the blood. And then we also have those combined chemical and electrical signals of the nervous system that can be directed to distant parts of the body very, very rapidly. And at the cellular level, we have cell signaling with two big patterns there. One is signal molecules that cannot enter the cell because they are lipophobic, but they have a surface receptor that they can bind to, and through signal transduction, the message goes from the extracellular signal molecule into the cell, and then that triggers a cell response. For the substances that are lipophilic, they can then simply cross the membrane and find intracellular receptors. And for most of those, the main response is going to be a slower response because it involves going into the nucleus and altering transcription and translation. So signals are fun. Signals, once you know the different patterns, they can give you a lot of information. So one signal can have different effects in different tissues. And it does that because it will depend upon what the receptor is and what the intracellular pathway is of the target cell. So this is a simple example where epinephrine binding to receptors, adrenergic receptors on blood vessels, depending upon if it binds to an alpha receptor, it will cause vasoconstriction. But if epinephrine binds to a beta 2 receptor in selected blood vessels, then it will actually cause vasodilation. So, but one signal molecule then is having different effects depending upon the receptor. One of the more difficult things I think about signaling is that it is not on and off. My students like to think it's sort of like a radio. You turn it on, it's either on and going or it's off. But what we have in so many systems is what is called tonic control. And tonic control is like having the radio on all of the time. So there's always noise, but the loudness is going to depend upon how you turn it up or how you turn it down. So it's up, down, not on, off. And here is an example from the cardiovascular system where we know that there is tonic control of the blood vessels. And that if you look at sympathetic control in blood vessels and measure the electrical signals from the neurons that are innervating that blood vessel, you'll find that they are always active. They are tonically active. And how do you get constriction and dilation? You change the signaling rate in the neuron. So if the signal rate decreases, you get less neurotransmitter and the blood vessel dilates. If you get signaling rate increasing, you get more neurotransmitter and you get vasoconstriction. So this is a good example then to remember for tonic control. And then we also have antagonistic control. And I think you're probably already familiar with this from the autonomic divisions of the nervous system, where you have different parts that have opposite actions on the target tissue. So here's our heart control of heart rate. As you probably have already learned, sympathetic speeds up heart rate. Parasympathetic slows down heart rate. So the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division are said to be antagonistic in their action on heart rate. But antagonism is not limited just to the nervous system. Here's another example from endocrinology, where you have insulin and glucagon. Both are present in the blood at all times, but it is the ratio of insulin to glucagon that determines which way metabolism goes. So insulin and glucagon then are antagonistic hormones to each other in respect to metabolism. So now we're getting to communication and control systems because these are critical for homeostasis. So, in a simple control system, which is actually very much like what an engineer might use, you have an input signal, you have an integrating center that evaluates the signal coming in and has been programmed to respond under certain circumstances. And if it responds, it gives an output signal, and the output signal goes to some target that carries out the response. And so classically, our control systems have always been the nervous system and the endocrine system. But I think one of the things we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic is that the immune system is right in there with the other two systems in terms of communicating information that has effects broadly across the body. It's not just there defending against invaders. In doing so, it's putting out cytokines, and those cytokines can have actions, as we have learned, in many, many different tissues. So we are now looking at this as a three-part control system where you have the endocrine system, the nervous system, and the immune system, and they're all talking to each other. So the nervous system puts out chemicals, and the generic term for them is neurocrine secretions. And those can be neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, or neurohormones. Those are all neurocrine molecules. The endocrine system puts out hormones, and the immune system puts out cytokines. And all three of the systems are talking to each other using these chemical signals. So the immune system is now becoming recognized as our third control system. So now we come to homeostasis, our final and probably the most important of our core concepts. So if an organism can remain in homeostasis, everything is wonderful. But if something happens and we lose homeostasis, then the body is challenged and we may become ill. So what is homeostasis? Our definition then is the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment. And if you remember, we said the internal environment is the extracellular fluid. And you notice we're not saying constant, it's not flat. We're saying relatively constant, so that there will be a range that is the acceptable or desirable range for a parameter. And as long as that parameter stays within that desirable range, the body is in homeostasis. If things go out of homeostasis, then the body attempts to compensate. And if it succeeds, we stay in a state of wellness. If it fails, we go into a state of illness or disease. And so remember then that homeostasis is that purple ring there. That is the extracellular fluid, the internal environment that is bathing the cells. And so most of the parameters then are going to be something that we can measure or look at in the extracellular fluid. The point of homeostasis really is everything is aimed at keeping the brain functioning. And if you remember that, it makes it much easier to think about what is happening. So we have 10 key regulated variables, all of which must be maintained within a desirable range in order to keep the brain functioning. And so I want you to take a second yourself and write down how many of these parameters or variables that are maintained homeostatically can you think about. So go ahead, consult with your classmates if you have a mechanism, but see if you can come up with the 10 variables that are homeostatically regulated.
Kalau mau jawab, ketik deh.
All right, let's see what we've got. Let's see how many of these you were able to think about. So here they are. Blood pressure, blood volume, which are not the same, oxygen, carbon dioxide, blood glucose, pH, which is the same as hydrogen ion concentration, osmolarity, potassium. And why is potassium important? Because it is the primary determinant for resting membrane potential, and that is going to play a huge role in the function of neurons. Calcium, because calcium through an indirect mechanism also is important for functioning of neurons, but also for secretion of neurotransmitters. And then finally, temperature. So those are your 10 key regulated variables. So if these variables stay within the desired range, the body's fine. But when they move outside the desired range, that will activate a sensor that will send a signal to the integrating center, and it will have an output that will then try to bring that regulated variable back into the desired range. And so this is our control system that we saw in a few slides back. So what is a regulated variable? So it turns out there's a very good, simple description. A regulated variable is any variable that is monitored by a sensor or receptor. And I prefer the word sensor because we use the word receptor for membrane receptors. And so I like to use sensor here because it is something that is sensing or monitoring the parameter. Some of these sensors are always active. They're tonically active. And so, for instance, your carotid and aortic baroreceptors for your blood pressure reflex are always firing. But others are only active periodically when something goes out of range. And so, for instance, the osmoreceptors, if the osmolarity is in a certain range, they're quiet. But when it goes out of range, they turn on and start sending signals. So homeostatic reflexes, we have lots of reflexes, but not all reflexes are homeostatic. For instance, if the stimulus is a blow to the knee for the patellar tendon reflex, you've got all of the parts of a reflex, but the response is the leg kicking out. And so that then is that's not homeostasis, that's just a reflex. But to be a homeostatic reflex, a reflex has to meet two requirements. The first is the stimulus is a change in a regulated variable, and we just looked at those 10 regulated variables. And the reflex has a negative feedback loop that will shut off the reflex once the variable turns back to an acceptable range. And so you can see here, the green bar shows the acceptable range. The red line is the set point. So the set point for temperature in this example is 30 degrees plus or minus 1 degree. And the variable can wander all over within the range without triggering a response. But if it hits either too high or too low, it will trigger the reflex to bring it back. And the negative feedback loop says the response has now gotten us back into the desired range, and so the response offsets the stimulus and therefore shuts off the pathway. Another thing to remember is that not all feedback is negative feedback. So the stimulus in a negative feedback, the response counteracts the stimulus and shuts off the response loop. But in some examples, not that many, we have positive feedback where the response reinforces the stimulus and sends the variable farther from the set point. And these are not in homeostasis. The classic example is the action potential, where a little bit of positive charge coming in makes it more positive, that opens more channels, and it requires a second channel to shut it off. Another example that we use for positive feedback is during delivery of a baby, where the stretch on the cervix causes the release of more oxytocin to cause more contraction and greater stretch, and it requires the baby to be delivered to remove the stretch and shut off the pathway. So remember, positive feedback is not homeostatic. To be homeostatic, it has to be negative feedback. So how is a regulated variable different from a controlled variable? Well, the simple example that I think makes a lot of sense is actually the baroreceptor reflex shown here. So you have an increase in blood pressure that causes the baroreceptors in the carotid artery and the aorta to fire more. You've got sensory neurons going into the cardiovascular control centers in the brain, and they have autonomic output that then has several acts on the arterioles as well as the heart. And the end result is a decrease in blood pressure. And you see, here's your negative feedback. The decrease in blood pressure removes the signal, and so the whole pathway stops. So what's regulated here and what's controlled? Well, remember we said a regulated variable is one, and here's another example, another way of showing it. The regulated variable is the one that is monitored by the sensors being the baroreceptors. So blood pressure then is the regulated variable. The controlled variables are on the output side of the reflex. They are what the control center is doing to respond. And so they are being controlled then by the control center in the brain. So regulated variable is monitored by sensors. Controlled variables are on the outside of the output side of the reflex. So we would say in a sentence, in the baroreceptor reflex, the body regulates blood pressure, your regulated variable, by controlling heart rate, force of cardiac contraction, and vasodilation. So there is a use of it in in a sentence. Now, honestly, most of your professors, and I am just as guilty as everyone else, tend to say regulate and control without thinking about it and maybe using it in not correctly. But regulated variables have a sensor. Everything else is being controlled. So we have no sensors for heart rate. There's no way for the body to tell what the heart rate is. It is monitoring blood pressure. So organ system functions now, we get to the fun part, everything starts to integrate. So you've got all of these mechanisms, and now let's see how we can integrate them. So here's the blood pressure that we were just talking about, mean arterial pressure. We just talked about these cardiovascular control mechanisms, but the kidneys can be just as important because blood volume will help determine arterial blood pressure. And so we now have to get the kidneys involved and potentially even get behavior involved, sending someone out to have a drink and increase their volume. And here we go with showing this as a map, same thing. We'll say response to decreased blood pressure. You've got all of the baroreceptor reflexes that we talked about in that first map. We have the kidneys that are then going to try and conserve the water and salt to maintain as much volume as they can. And then we have behavior that sends us off to go find water to try and restore the volume. pH is similar in that pH requires coordination between the respiratory systems and the kidneys. And so the output is through ventilation, which is quite rapid and often done so easily that we are not aware of it. And then the slower output is the kidneys that can take as much as 24 hours to pick up the fact that there is a pH issue and that they need to be doing something to help. And then where this becomes important is that you start to see the overlap between the systems and the pathologies. A disease or a disorder in one system will often show up in other systems. And we certainly saw that with COVID-19, where supposedly this was a pulmonary respiratory system problem, and now people were having problems in multiple other systems. So very often understanding the mechanism behind the pathology is critical for the treatment. And so I'll show you two examples. One is dehydration, and the second one is diabetes mellitus. So here's a very complex map. I don't know that you can see it very easily, but it's dehydration, which is demonstrated by a decrease in blood volume and along with that, a decrease in blood pressure. And at the same time, it's an increase in osmolarity. So you are triggering multiple homeostatic pathways. And so you can see 4 color bars here. The first one is the cardiovascular mechanisms that are trying to restore blood pressure. The lavender or purple one is the middle, and this is also an attempt, but it's acting primarily on the kidneys to try and restore and maintain, not restore, but to maintain the blood volume. But it turns out angiotensin 2, right here, this white block in the middle, right above the adrenal cortex, look at it. It goes over and it talks to multiple systems. It crosses systems. Then we have the direct effect GFR, which is that brown bar. And then finally, we have the hypothalamic mechanisms that include thirst and vasopressin to try and continue reabsorbing water to prevent any further loss of volume. So you've got a complex mechanism, but if you understand what is happening mechanistically, it tells you how to treat it. So the pathology has been loss of dilute body fluid, and the treatment then is simple. This is a mass balance issue now. Replace what was lost, and you should be back in homeostasis. So knowing your mechanisms and being able to think through them this way is important as you learn to think about your diagnosis and treatment in the clinics. And then finally, here's another complex map. This is a type 1 diabetic in diabetic ketoacidosis. And it's simply here to show you the overlap of all the different systems that get involved. You have metabolic disturbances. You then have the hyperglycemia that can cause osmotic diuresis and polyuria. So there is the kidney getting involved, and now you're dehydrated, and now you're at that big map that we just looked at. You've got behavior changes, the polydipsia that is typical of the type 1 diabetic. And in this case, the answer is the problem is the type 1 diabetic has no insulin, and the treatment, the simplest treatment for that is to correct the problem, which is to give insulin. Treat the symptoms as necessary, but whenever possible, look at correcting the underlying mechanism that has gone wrong. And so then we have type 2 diabetics, and as you know, if you've done anything in the clinics, they show up with problems in multiple systems because the loss or the resistance to insulin is causing problems across multiple systems. And so changes then in one system can have a cascade effect and cause problems in another. So remembering the mechanisms and the core concepts are going to help you as you try and learn your pathophysiology and your pharmacology. And I hope today introducing you to the core concepts has given you an idea of how to look for these patterns. So just keep remembering physiological function is integrated. Just because something's happening in one system doesn't mean that all the other systems are quiet. And so with that, I say thank you. And I guess, do we have questions, Professor?
Oke, Felicia, silakan pimpin diskusinya. Pasti ada pertanyaan.
All right, thank you for the very in-depth and knowledgeable review of physiology by Professor D. Silverthorn. Now for all of my friends and acquaintances, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or type it in chat. For Imam Ropid Alhan Ashari, the stage is yours.
All right. Good morning or good evening, Professor D,
Thank you.
Professor Irfan. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture that you gave us today. I am so grateful to have the opportunity to see you today. Before that, I am Imam. You can call me Imam. And I would like to ask you a question that I've been meaning to ask you since the first scheduled session that was canceled a couple weeks or a couple months ago, probably. But before I ask my question, there's a very interesting thing that I saw on the internet a couple of days ago. So there's this old patient who came to see a doctor, and when the doctor checked on her, her blood pressure was rising so high. But instead of giving her any sort of medication, the doctor simply touched her carotid arteries, which stimulated her blood pressure to drop to a normal state. The doctor then said that it was one of the ways to stimulate the vagal nerve and then command the heart to slow down. So this is one of the example of one of the application of physiology that amazes me the most. And it seems like a magic to me, you know? So my question is, do you have any sort of interesting experiences or cases in applying physiology in your daily life or on a particular occasion? I think that is my question. Thank you, Professor.
Good question. And that's a very interesting example. We actually had something very similar with one of our medical students. She suddenly developed a very rapid heart rate, And so they took her over to our emergency room and they tried the same thing that you just described, which, if you think about it, that's the baroreceptor reflex, right? If you're pushing on the carotid, all of a sudden the carotid thinks, it doesn't think, but it's sensing an increase in pressure, and it's sending the signal to the brain of, let's have the output to drop the pressure. So they did that with her, and it didn't work. So they did a second physiology example that I love, which comes actually from comparative physiology, which is they took a bowl of ice water and they made her dunk her face into the ice water. And I don't know if you all have studied this. It's called the mammalian diving reflex, and it is typical of the diving mammals, but it will trigger a reflex bradycardia. And so they tried that as well for her. And as it turned out, neither worked, and she ended up having to have a pacemaker. But that's another example of how you can use it. And a very common one that you will probably come across, maybe in Friends, maybe in the emergency room, is where people go into hysterical hyperventilation. You know, they start crying and they're going, and they get all upset and they're breathing. And then all of a sudden they're going, oh, I feel terrible. My lips are tingling and numb and I can't feel my hands. And they have gone into a respiratory alkalosis. And so the simple treatment for that is to take a paper bag and put it over their face so that then they start to rebreathe their own carbon dioxide, and that brings their pH back up. So there are a lot of places that once you know the physiology, it's fun to apply it to your everyday life. Nice question.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor D, for your answer, and thank you for Imam Ropit for asking. If we have any more questions, please raise your hand or type in chat.
Professor D, while we wait for another question, I remember that I have one question asked by our student that I'm not sure to answer that. Maybe you can share with us to answer the question. The question is that when there is the disturbance of homeostasis, so there will be a disease and like pathophysiological condition, and it will occur the sign and symptom of the disease. However, with the when we know that there is like condition is very bad condition, but the subjective perception from the patient is not too seriously. Seems it's like there is no disease on his body, but in other person that maybe it's a small thing, the changes of homeostasis, but the patient looks like very bad ill, and they saw us to very danger condition, something like that. So which means that there is several various perception of the individual based on their condition. So they asked me that how to explain it in physiological way in homeostasis regulation. Thank you, Prof. Maybe you can share with us.
Well, what you're describing to me is out of the realm of physiology and getting
Yes.
more into the realm of psychology and psychiatry, because
Yes.
there's a very strong connection between our brain and our physiology. And so people can deny the denial mechanism that they are sick and just keep going. And other people can be not ill by anything that we can see, and yet they are feeling very bad. So that moves out of just physiology, I think, into the psychology part, which we still can't explain very well. I mean, we just don't understand what all of those neural connections in the brain are doing in cases like that.
So which means that in physiological manners cannot be explained.
I don't think there's physiology that explains that. I think that is more in psychiatry.
Okay. Yeah. So that's why I'm sure about my answer for them. Okay. Ada lagi dek pertanyaan, silakan Pak Lisa.
If there's anyone else who wants to ask a question, we are okay. Fikri Rablian, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Good evening for Professor D. My name is Mohammad Fikri Rablian. You can call me Fikri for short. So Professor D, as we learned a lot about physiology, we've been exposure to a lot of information about diabetes. And also with the Professor Japan, like 1 or 2 months ago, we talked a lot about diabetes. And so it got me thinking about the culture that we have here in Indonesia. I don't know if you've heard this before, but in our country, we have the culture of eating white rice 3 times a day for breakfast, for lunch, and also for dinner. And so, as we all know, white rice has a pretty high glycemic index, right? And so I was thinking, well, maybe one of the reasons why the prevalence of diabetes in Indonesia is yet still high is because the culture that we have, which is eating white rice 3 times a day. And so my question to you is that do you view it or do you see it as a problem, the culture that we have as a problem? And do you think that as medical students it's our duty to actually promote and educate people to seek for another alternative for carbs or carbohydrates? Thank you so much. Professor D, I'm looking forward to your answer.
Thank you, Fikri. One of the things that is very big in American medical schools now is what we call social determinants of health. And I don't know if you use that phrase there, but it's just what you're talking about, which is how the culture and the person's environment at home and at work plays into their health. And so in the United States, it's not so much, I think, it would not be eating white rice 3 times a day, but our problem is lack of exercise and not getting out. And so if people are eating rice 3 times a day, but they're keeping their weight normal and they're exercising, surely that cannot be that bad, but I would definitely say you should be trying to encourage people and educate people about diet. And do people eat brown rice there much? Is that an alternative for meals?
Yeah, I don't think we do that a lot in Indonesia, but I think for some people who's like on diet, they do it.
Okay. Yeah, so trying to convince people to eat better. I mean, teaching them about glycemic index is important, but very often this sort of goes back to what Professor Irfan was saying about the people come in. My husband is a family physician, a general practitioner, and he will have people come in for their annual examination, and he has done blood tests and it comes back and they have type 2 diabetes. Their blood glucose is elevated. And he says, okay, now you need to be doing all of these things. You need to try and exercise more. You need to lose weight. You need to watch what you're eating. And they go, but I don't feel bad. So why should I do these things? I felt fine until I came in here and now you're telling me I'm sick. And so it's very challenging when people are not already sick and feeling bad to get them to change their lifestyle. And so it almost takes a whole movement, and the physicians, the doctors doing education may be able to help, but I don't know how much, especially since that is so ingrained in the culture to have rice at 3 meals. I'm not sure how effective it will be until people get sick.
All right, thank you, Professor D, for the answer. Does anyone else want to ask any more questions? Please raise your hand or you can type in chat.
So I have a question for you. I see all of these letters, B and G, I think, and A, and then these screens behind. Are you in groups? Are those your groups that you're in, and you picked a name and a design?
Lisa, please answer this question.
It's like our class here, Professor.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we separate there into the 6 class or 3 class, alpha, beta, and gamma. So they just put it like beta Via and gamma Lewis. It's
Okay.
beta and gamma. Okay, they are come from the different classes. Okay. Ayo adik-adik tanya lagi dek tentang ini fisiologinya, mumpung beliau masih ada sama kita. Apa yang masih bingung kemarin tentang fisiologi? Ayo, monggo.
We have Tania Putri Zahira.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tania. So, Professor G, can I ask you something about, maybe it's kind of out of topic, but can you tell us a little bit of your story of making a wonderful physiology book and how you're mastering all of that material in maybe how long you learn about everything that you know about how does the body work? Okay, so that's for me. Thank you, Professor.
Well, I started on the book before most of you were born. So we're working now on the 9th American edition. The first edition came out in 1997, and I didn't plan to write a book. I sort of was asked to do it, and I liked the books that were already being published, but I thought, what could I do differently? And what I could do differently was incorporate cellular and molecular biology, because the other books had all been published for the first time before 1980, which is really when cellular and molecular biology started picking up. And so this is this idea of the integrated approach of taking everything from molecules and cells all the way through the intact human body. And so that was the focus of the book. And I have and will always be very grateful to many, many of my colleagues, because I did not know a lot of this information when I started, but I studied just like a student, and I had very kind colleagues who helped teach me in areas that were not my strength, like muscle, for instance. That was a very difficult one for me because I had never studied it before, and all of a sudden I'm supposed to write a book about it. But the book is really the work of a lot of people. I am just the one that puts it on paper, but it has input from many, many of my friends and colleagues, and I will always be very grateful for that.
So which means that you have to be practice, Professor D, to learn and to repeat it again.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like me that I try to teach in every topic of physiology several years ago. So I like to teach neurology, and then after 1 year, 2 years, I changed to teach musculoskeletal. So that's why I have to learn to master it. So it is what I have did. If you want to, yeah, of course you have to do like that.
Well, I think, and it's something I tell my students, the best way to find out if you have learned something is to try and teach it to someone. And
Yeah.
so when I have my students working in groups together, trying to learn material, I tell them, if you know this material, be quiet and try and ask the people that in your group that don't understand to explain it. And then you try and help them explain it, because very often you can't explain it any way except the words you memorized in the book. But I also think that people become professors because we really like being students at the bottom of it. And you just confirmed that, Professor Irfan, by saying that you were teaching things that you had to go learn.
Right. Thank you, Professor D and Prof. Irfan also.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor D and Professor Irfan and Tania Putri for the question. If you have any more questions, we have Pauline Jeremy.
Okay, thank you so much, Felicia. My name is Pauline and I'm from the class of Gamalius. I want to ask a question from the previous slide. So one thing that really catch my attention is about a single signal can have different effects, like the epinephrine, if it binds to the alpha receptor in the intestinal blood vessels, it will make the vessel constrict, but if it binds in the skeletal muscle blood vessels, it will make the vessel dilate. So is there any other signals besides epinephrines that make a different effects if it binds in different receptors? Thank you.
Yes, I think it's probably almost every single molecule we know of, because when you start getting more into pharmacology, you will start learning about all of the subtypes of the receptors, and each of the subtypes is connected to a different or slightly different second messenger system. So there are multiple, I will make a very bold statement and say almost every signal then can have different effects in different tissues. It is the receptor that determines the effect, not so much the signal. All the signal does is turn on the receptor.
All right. Thank you, Professor D, for the answer. I hope that satisfies your question, Pauline Jeremy. Is there anyone else that likes to ask? Nujia, Layla? Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. I want to ask a question, Professor. Nowadays, there are still many people who use traditional medicine to treat physiological condition. Sometimes the treatment is successful, but sometimes it's not, and it get worse. Now, in Indonesian tradition, we usually, if an accident occurs, such as a sprained foot, brushes, and etc., we will do massage as one of the therapies that can be done. My question is, what do you think about traditional medicine and the treatment handled by doctors? Thank you. And I want to say directly to thank you very much for your extraordinary book, which makes us easier to study. Thank you so much, Professor.
No, thank you very much. Yes, I think there's a very important role for this type of traditional treatment. Occasionally, sometimes it can be harmful, but there are many things that are traditional that have a basis in actual physiology and pharmacology. And in the United States, our National Institute for Health has a National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. And their focus is actually to look at many of these alternative treatments. So for instance, they are trying to get people to do well-controlled studies to determine whether something is actually effective or if it is simply a placebo effect, which can be very powerful, but you shouldn't have to go spend money for something if it's a placebo effect. And so they have approved, for instance, acupuncture for certain conditions. I mean, they are saying there is good evidence now to support the use of acupuncture. And there are some herbal medicines and some other alternative, or we call them complementary treatments. And so, yes, I think there's definitely a role for it. And as long as it's as I said, my husband, as long as it is not doing harm, then he is fine with people doing the additional non-medical treatments.
Thank you for the answer, Professor.
All right. Thank you for the answer, Professor D. And we already got another question, Muhammad Badarudin.
So, good morning, Professor. I have a question about these cases. So, there's a lot of osteoporosis cases in older women in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, there's a program called KB or Keluarga Berencana, which advise women to get a contraception. And I read from a few articles that contraception will lower the women estrogen. Do you think that the osteoporosis is the cause of body losing its homeostasis because the contraception kind of like ruin the production of the estrogen on women? Thank you.
I have never seen a link between contraception and osteoporosis. Generally, it is because of the person's own estrogens. After menopause, the estrogens are not being released by the ovary, and so that is what is causing the osteoporosis primarily. And so then the question is what kind of therapy to use for it. We do have, there is hormone replacement therapy is a little bit controversial, but then there are other drugs that have been developed that help stabilize the bone. And so they're probably pretty expensive, so I don't know how widely available they are there in Indonesia. But I have never seen a link between contraceptive use and osteoporosis.
All right. Thank you for the answer once again, Professor D. Is there anyone else that wants to ask? Iqbal Fadil Chandra.
All right. Good morning, Professor D, or perhaps it's good evening for you. I'm so thankful for the chance today. It's such a rare occasion for me to meet a very influencing person in the physiologist field like you. Before that, I want to talk about how in every other medicine subfield I've been learned, it seems that every person is special by the mean that the biology of human itself is really full of variation. So my question is, in the physiology itself, are the homeostatic mechanism of body is universally same on human, or there is also a variation of how our body maintain the temperable homeostatic mechanism that perhaps affected by the genetics? because as what I know from my knowledge, that in some people, let's say in indigenous people in Amazon forest, I know that they have such a tradition that been long for hundred years, in which they getting bited by a bullet ant. In which what I want to ask is, are they have a kind of tolerant much higher or less body pH than other human, or even our body is past physiologies capable of creating a new enzyme, and that not so common in a human, or it's just as simple as they tolerate the pain more, even though it still feel just as hard as other human. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're absolutely. That's a good question, because there is a tremendous amount of variability in human beings, both from genetics and I assume you all know about epigenetics, right? So the modification of DNA outside of what you've inherited, as well as the environmental effects that can cause changes in the epigenome. And so, yes, there's tremendous variability. Probably the simplest one is to look at people's body temperature. And you can see that the normal body temperature for people is all over the place. And sometimes when we talk about what is normal, this is a mathematical normal where you've got if it's a bell-shaped curve, you're looking at the majority, but there will be people who lie outside the quote normal range, but they're fine, they're healthy. And so there is a lot of variability that you have to look at the individual and see, is this normal for them? And then their homeostasis will be based on their normal values, not on the average value you find. The issue of pain, you were talking about the bullet and the pain. I mean, this again is going into the realm of neuroscience, where some people have developed the ability to block the pain pathways, the ascending pathways for pain, before it gets to the level of perception. And so that's, I don't know how much of that is training and how much of that then is from their own genetics. But yes, there's a lot of the genetics that will play into this.
All right, thank you for the answer, Professor D. We still have a few minutes. Is there anyone else who wants to ask any questions? It seems like there's no one else that wants to ask questions. Is it Professor Ivan ini
Yeah.
langsung ditutup atau?
Okay, because it's already 9 o'clock in the evening in the Austin, so it's getting late now. I do believe that Professor D want to take rest for her activity tomorrow. So I think it is the time is enough, and then all of you have to go to another session, I do believe. Okay, we can close now. Okay, Professor D, yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Felicia, for being our moderator today. You did a very nice job.
Thank you too, Prof, for attending and giving us a college about physiology. It was very helpful and very insightful. I, as the moderator, will close our session for today. So thank you to Professor Dr. Irfan, Specialist of Sport Medicine and Master of Medicine Education. Thank you to Professor D. Silverthorn for attending our lecture for today. That's all from me, I think. Good night, Professor D, and good day to all of my friends and colleagues. That's all from me. Thank you very much once again, Professor.
Okay, thank
Thank
you,
you.
Professor Lee. See you soon.
Yes, and thank you
Okay,
all for
Lee.
coming. I've enjoyed it. You've done a very nice job with the questions. Good questions.
Thank you very much.
So,
See
all
you.
right. Bye.
Bye, Professor. Yeah. See you.